stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you?
I've had concerns about Indian Point for a long time. As Attorney General, I did a lot of work on Indian Point. My position was that it shouldn't be relicensed. My position was that it should be closed. My position was that it was, I understand the power and the benefit. I also understand the risk. And this plant in this proximity to New York City was never a good risk.
Reforming the Energy Vision, REV, is Governor Cuomo's plan to build the energy grid of tomorrow, today in New York State.
My background on this is as a technology reporter, somebody who's concerned about the environment. You know, I used to be editor of Popular Mechanics magazine, so I've covered a lot of technical issues. I'm not an expert on a deep level the way you are, but I know how to report science and technology stories. And the more I looked into the Indian Point situation, the more experts I talked to, I realized really what a tragedy it is to be shutting down this this resource prematurely. And then when I started looking into the promises that renewable energy would take its place, I realized that that's just not true, and it's not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen. It's because of energy density. How much energy can you pack per unit volume? That's really what it comes down to.
So describe the workings of that plant. Not everybody really understands how a light water nuclear plant works.
Right.
So just give us the basics of what happens inside those dome containment vessels.
Generally speaking, you've got an ongoing nuclear reaction, okay? You've got atoms being split, okay? When the atom gets split, uranium, neutrons pop out, a bunch of neutrons. It's like kind of like breaking an egg. And that permits the splitting of nearby atoms, and so on and so on and so on. That's exactly what's happening in this conventional style nuclear plant. They're in basically pellets. The fuel rods are roughly 1 meter long, and they're these pellets. It actually looks like a Pez dispenser because they're in these racks. And it continues to go, okay? It continues to go. And that continuous splitting is what generates the massive amount of heat, okay? When you split the atom, you're releasing huge amounts of energy.
But how do you turn that heat into electricity?
You turn the heat into electricity by managing that heat with a so-called working fluid. In this case, it's going to be water.
So you take that heat, you use it to heat up a different loop of water to run turbines.
Correct.
To turn the generators and make the power.
That's correct.
And I think most people, if they think about it, they probably realize that most electric power we have comes from something turning a turbine.
Absolutely.
It might be water in a dam, it might be a coal plant that heats up water and makes steam to turn turbines, or a natural gas plant that turns turbines. And those turn generators. That's where our electricity comes from.
Correct.
Unless it's coming from a solar panel on your roof.
These light water reactors were actually designed for roughly 80 years. An 80-year lifespan with the potential to re-up. And if you look at places like Indian Point, which I think is roughly 45, 46 years old?
I think the two reactors were built in the early 70s.
Okay, yeah. Right. So roughly 45, 46 years old right now. They're only slightly past 1/2 of their intended life expectancy, their performance lifespan. They still have a lot of life to go.
Right.
In them. And so too are those fuel rods designed for that in mind, that scale in mind. You know, the scale not only for the total output, which is wonderful, and you think how close it is to New York City, and also the planned long-term performance of the actual fuel rod assemblies, in addition to the fuel rods themselves, the fuel rod assemblies, all of the infrastructure that's associated with it. It's all planned for that type of lifespan. And we're only slightly more than halfway through it. Like you just mentioned, like with hydroelectric power, anything, you have to turn something. You have to turn copper wires through magnetic fields in some configuration or another. I'm being extremely general. And it's that motion, okay, that kinetic energy, right, that is what actually makes electric fields, alternating current, or in the cases like you just said, direct current with solar panels, for example. That's what makes actual either electric fields when it comes to alternating current or AC, or actual electrons moving down like drops of water down a copper wire of direct current, just like our batteries or or laptops or what have you. It's that motion that's needed. We need to change the energy in the form of heat to steam. That steam imparts that energy, like I had just mentioned previously, because of the demonstrable difference in energy between liquid water at 100 Celsius versus steam at 100 Celsius. Now, it turns out that these suckers are at roughly 300 Celsius and under enormous pressures in order to maintain that. That's what actually moves these huge turbines, which drag the copper through the fields, or in some geometry, again, I'm being very general here, the copper windings through the magnetic fields, and that's what ultimately generates it. That's wonderful.
So through that process, Indian Point is putting out about 2,000 megawatts. What does that mean for the consumer, and how does that compare to other energy sources in our region? It's estimated to be about 25% of the power consumed in the New York metro area, and about 11% of the power produced in New York State.
Okay.
So, a fairly sizable proportion, one plant putting out more than 10% of the state's power. It seems like a pretty significant.
It's massive. It's massive. We have 19.8 million people in New York State, and we have. I mean, if you think about it, it's roughly 50% of them are in the metro New York City area, roughly 8.6 million. So it's like, wow, that's a huge amount of energy consumption. Now we have the wonderful efficiencies that living in cities, that brings a lot of efficiency. Nevertheless, you have huge consumption. The other interesting thing that people don't really think about is, this stuff is plugged in. Let's say we have the TV running. That electricity was made at most a couple of seconds ago.
Right.
It's the immediacy of the need and the immediacy of the consumption of the electricity that is, to me, a lot of people don't think about that. That's important.
Yeah.
I bring this up because there's a historical component to this. On Long Island, there are actually a couple of small municipalities that way back, I think it's upwards of 80 or 90 years ago, with the advent of the Niagara Falls hydroelectric power, that they actually ran transmission lines down to Long Island. And I know Freeport, Long Island, and I believe Lynbrook, and I think there are two other municipalities. I want to say Valley Stream, but I'm not sure. They actually still use that, and they still enjoy cheap power. But that was then, and this is now. The amount of energy that you would have to bring down and set up all of that from New York State, from Niagara Falls, all the way down to the metro. How are you going to do that?
Advocates for closing Indian Point will say it's really not a problem because we can replace that power with wind and solar, and we can bring more hydropower down. Most of the hydropower in New York is coming from very far upstate or from Canada.
Or from Canada, yes, good point.
And but you're making a point that transporting power over great distances, isn't that easy, right? What's involved?
It's costly. You have basically usually between 220 and 280 kV, so 220,000 to 280,000 volt transmission lines, those monster.
That's why they build those towers so high, to keep those lines away from anything where they might short circuit.
It's not even so much a question of short circuiting, because they're usually extremely well insulated. It's a question of the massive voltages running through that thing. You don't want that. Why do you think Enron literally was burning in California? It's because those transmission lines, you're going to have
Wait, Enron?
Yeah, Enron back in the 90s. You actually had transmission lines catching on fire because they weren't spending any money on effective forestry management. We're going to have to bring all of that here. The heat that's generated, the static fields that are created on the towers themselves, even with that much insulation, at those voltages, you're going to get voltage leakage. And this is well known. Like this is why they're so effectively grounded. This is also why, for example, when you watch the brave men and women who actually work on these things, they're fully encased in chainmail, just like the old Faraday cages.
Right.
Because they're screwing around with this stuff, and they know that there is parasitic voltage leakage. There is no such thing as a dielectric constant of infinity. At some point, voltage can jump from one item to another item. That's why such extreme precautions, even for the guys who work on the 25 kV transformers down here, they're fully gloved up. They're fully grounded, right? With that ground runs directly to the ground, literally to the ground, okay? Because they want to serve as a passive conduit to get any stray voltage away from them, right?
Right.
It always travels via the path of least resistance. Well, at those magnitudes, it doesn't matter that much. And why do you think all these forest fires? Why do you think there was so much penalty that was imposed on the
PG&E in California?
Precisely.
They're in Chapter 11 because their power lines running through rural areas have been implicated in a number of major fires, including the big campfire last year that killed 85 people.
Exactly.
What I'm interested in here is there are a lot of assumptions being made by people who think we can replace our big nuclear plants with far-flung installations of wind and solar. I mean, nobody's going to be putting wind turbines in the middle of Central Park or Westchester County. They're going to be far up the Hudson or far west New York. All that power has to get to New York. That's not so easily done, is it?
You need an intelligent energy landscape. You need to think about it. I'm not anti-solar. I'm not anti-wind. There's a time and a place for it, okay? If the geometries and the landscapes and the relative distances are appropriate, fine. Australia actually has 5 examples where, and I grant you there was a huge capex associated with it, a huge capital expenditure because each plant is different. But they've succeeded with renewables. But it took a heck of a lot of design and planning and money in order to get there. But they chose the right landscape. They chose the right climate, the right weather conditions, the right geometries. There's a lot of planning that went into it. You don't have those luxuries in the metro New York area or anywhere in the Northeast Corridor.
Well, certainly if you look at solar power, it's hard to imagine an area, continental U.S., less suited to solar than upstate New York, where you get a lot of cloudy days and short days and very short days in the winter.
But what most Americans, the overwhelming majority, I would submit, don't get is scale. They don't get the scale, and they don't get energy density. Even worse, and I say worse because it's a shame. I want more people to understand the massive scales you're talking about. Trivia question: how many wavelengths does the average high-end solar panel use? Silicon oxide. Answer: 4. 4.
You're describing the total
number of wavelengths
of energy that's coming in
from the sun.
We only see the visible range,
correct,
chunk in the middle, but that's all energy coming in. And how much does the solar panel harvest?
4. So 1% of the whole number integer wavelengths coming from the sun, this wonderful light source, are being used. 4. That's 1%, and that's just 1% of the wavelengths. You're not talking about at all the overall efficiency of commuting that incoming photonic energy, the sunlight, into actual electrons popping out of your solar panel. That's important. The efficiency of the single crystal, the best, most wonderful silicon oxide solar panels is something along the lines of 17%. Well, that's terrible.
Now, everyone says, I think there's an assumption that solar panels are just going to keep getting better and better, kind of the way we've all seen in our lifetimes. Computer memory has, more than doubled every year. And the famous Moore's constant. And there's a natural assumption, well, there's other high-tech, modern technology probably will advance that way too. Is that going to happen?
It's going that way, but this is really, really tough stuff. Photochemistry and trying to translate, in general, light into usable electrons, which based on the conventions that we have, is really tough stuff. It's really hard. So it does not work on Moore's law, nowhere near it.
Progress is real, but slow.
It's very, very slow. So just to give another example, in stark comparison, coal is a failure. Coal is a failure on so many different levels.
Fortunately, we don't burn a lot of coal in New York State, but we do burn a lot of natural gas for electricity. We have a handful of nuclear plants. The notion that we can replace all of that with renewables, or 80% by 2050, as our governor is predicting, it means we have to be moving a lot more power much longer distances than we do today.
And producing a lot more inefficiently.
And do we even have the power lines and the infrastructure to do that?
No, we don't, because think about it. You're now dramatically changing your distribution network, right? From a single, let's say, Indian point, now you're spreading it way out.
Into other states.
And you're talking about scores of square miles of these panels. How are you going to do that? How are you going to do that? What about the prospect of having a natural gas turbine nearby? Their efficiencies have gone up substantially. The most efficient natural gas turbines to generate electricity are upwards of 52% efficient. That's amazing. Well, okay, but we know CO2 is a greenhouse gas. We know that it contributes to the exacerbation of smog in high particulate areas, exactly like New York City. There's a reason why all of those kids in the South Bronx are getting asthma at grossly inflated rates, because it's all a very strange and complex chemical mishmash that's going on in the low atmosphere. Well, wow, wait a second. Don't do that then. Don't produce all of that CO2 in such proximity to the metro New York area. Just don't do that.
Some entrepreneurs and scientists say that if we wanted to, we could run whole countries on sunlight and wind.
It actually doesn't take much. If you wanted to power the entire United States with solar panels, you only need about 100 miles by 100 miles.
But there's a problem with renewables we still haven't solved. Storing power from when the sun is shining and the wind is blowing so we can use that power later. We do this all the time with batteries at home, but AA's won't cut it on a national scale. Replacing fossil fuels will require ingenious ways to store power. Some methods have been around for a while. The US has stored power in reservoirs since the 1930s. We pump water uphill when power is abundant and release it downhill to spin turbines when power is scarce. In the same way, we can pump empty caves full of compressed air so it can be released to spin turbines later. We can even store power by beaming concentrated sunlight onto towers of molten salt, which can stay hot enough to turn water into useful steam for as long as a week. And Elon Musk is still pinning his hopes on batteries, which are easy to charge and transport. Putting these technologies to use nationally will be a huge undertaking though. Right now, the US stores less than 3% of its total power needs at any one time. And we only meet 10% of our energy demand with renewables. To hit 100% would require an enormous investment, not only in solar panels and turbines, but in storage too. You can't put a reservoir just anywhere, and fields of batteries or salt power storage for solar plants are still more expensive than coal. Critics worry that proclaiming the renewable renaissance is right around the corner can actually make it harder to move toward that future. It discounts other energy tech, like nuclear power, and ignores all of the research and development we still have to do to give renewables a bigger slice of the market.